Andrea, and I'm the owner and director of Waves of Harmony. And today I have Mick Georges, who is the owner and co-founder of Keystone Australia and Moral Injury AU. Good day, Mick.
One company's not enough, Andrea. You've got to have at least two going. So you've got a little bit of improvement to go there.
Well, I'm only just past 1 year in my first company, so
yeah, okay.
It's not a bad track record.
It makes sense. You're doing okay. And you got your own podcast. I mean, I don't have a podcast, so you one up on me from there.
For all my viewers today, Mick Georges is a chaplain, and he also founded the Moral Injury AU, which is working with people who've had some moral injury. And I'm going to just basically hand it over to Mick to share a concise resume of his background so that we can get an idea of him. And today we're going to be talking about spirituality in our therapy sessions, and Mick's going to give us a little rundown on that. So take it away, Mick. Give your...
Sure, and I'm going to focus on the word concise. So I started my career as an infantry officer. So I was a parachutist, jumping out of planes, leading troops on operations, border security operations, all that sort of stuff. So infantry, just think of the blokes holding machine guns, heavy packs, walking slowly towards the enemy. That was me for 20 years. And then I did an in-service transfer to become a defence chaplain. And I did that for about another, just shy of 10 years full-time. And I was invited to apply for a position with a very large mental health company in Australia. It was an international company, and was their national on-site services manager. So I put mental health clinicians and chaplains into industries all around Australia. So think mines, prisons, government offices, private enterprise. That was fantastic. Parallel to that, my wife and I have had a couple of companies. Keystone, which is a consulting company. We do a lot of work in the mental health chaplaincy space, coaching, mentoring, as well as occupational violence, psychosocial, teamwork, leadership, all those sort of things. And Moral Injury AU we founded because currently, to the best of our knowledge, we're still the only company in Australia that provides training and a qualification to provide mental health clinicians and chaplains and other interested parties with a qualification to support those with moral injury. And moral injury has just been added as a Z code into the DSM and is now very live and kicking. And if you want to know more about moral injury, you can go into the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide and look at the entire chapter on it, because it was found to be a major contributing factor to defence and veteran suicide.
Not only that, but we also are going to be airing another talk with you, another vlog that we are recording that's going to go into depth in your words about your experience and what you do with moral injury. So we also have that coming forth in another conversation. Today, we're focusing mainly on spirituality, and the idea actually started, I'll give a little bit of background on my part where the idea started for me, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of pick up from there. So my feeling, now I'm a therapist of 18 years, but when I first started working in palliative care as a music therapist, I found that the talks around what I thought were spirituality, I think they were more about religiosity and the feeling that I always had to bring God into the talk or Jesus into the talk really intimidated me as a young early career therapist. And I think that I had this feeling that I wasn't quite covering spirituality with the people I was working with in such a really important population that I was serving, which was palliative care, people who were dying. So I feel like I always kind of wondered, how can I do that better? How can I get comfortable doing that? And I guess through our discussions, Mick, what I wanted to share in this vlog was how I'm actually doing that and didn't really realize. So first thing I would like to actually have you discuss a little bit is just about how, with your training as a chaplain, mainly in that background, can you just talk about that, sort of like your specific training in those areas, how that might be different from a counselor or a therapist, a psychotherapist, or a psychiatrist, and the role of spiritual care or religiosity in each of those?
Well, okay, and we're going to do all that in 2 minutes, so that's not going to be a problem at all. That sounds like a PhD thesis statement. But so let's just try. If anybody's got a lot of detailed research in this, they're going to cringe at what I'm about to say, because this is going to be some superficial stuff. But let's go entry. If we look at, say, religion as a group of people have come together and they agree on on a common understanding of a higher entity. And so, and then there's a formal structure behind that belief. So when we look at religion, we'll often look at institutions or organizations, and we can label those, say, Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism. Now, some of those are quite flexible. Others are very rigid in terms of their understanding of what's right and what's wrong, what culture we should have, what ceremonies we should follow. So there's an objective structure around religion or religiosity in what you're saying.
Yes.
Spirituality there's obviously a whole range of different ways you could define this, but perhaps it might be helpful for this discussion. The spirituality is a little bit more subjective. Well, I'd suggest very subjective. It's an individual's perspective, but still there's a something bigger than self. But it's the individual's interpretation of what that bigger than self is. So this is terrible from an Oxford Dictionary point of view. But if we look at religiosity from what you're saying, there's an objective truth around that where a whole heap of people have commonality and an understanding. And then spirituality is an individual understanding, but where the overlap is that there's something bigger than just self. And so that's where, if we're going to have two concentric circles, and you can see I'm drawing those, there'd be an overlap there in the middle, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
How's that? Does that sort of put it in the right direction?
Definitely. And I think even like for younger people, or like I was saying, an early career therapists, I think sometimes we do sort of grapple with those two terms, religiosity and spirituality. How are the same? How are they different? What is the overlap? And how is that? So then I want you to talk a little bit about how maybe as a chaplain, you might address each of those, and how perhaps you might see the people who you work with who are counselors and psychologists, how you train them in that space or how they use it in their space from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So when I have the privilege of starting to help somebody who may be struggling with life, one of the key indicators that I'm looking at as they're telling me their story is I'm wanting to unpack, how do they see the world? How do they see the world? What's their perspective of some of those terms we've just been talking about? Do they have a faith? If so, what is their faith? Because from their perspective, if there's a faith, and we're using the word religion over that, then there's some objective truths that person will hold. But even then, if I'm, for example, speaking to somebody, I'm a Christian, so that's an area of strength for me. Even within a Christian worldview, are they from an Eastern Orthodox tradition, or an Orthodox tradition, or a Roman Catholic tradition, or a Protestant tradition? And even if they're in any one of those traditions, there are multiple subsections that come through. Are they Presbyterian? Are they Baptist? Are they Pentecostal? For example, if I'm identifying that the person believes there's a higher entity rather than just themselves, but they don't identify as being religious, well, what exactly does that mean for them? That's a really important question to have an understanding for. Or maybe they don't believe in spirituality or religion at all. So an atheist or a nihilist, somebody with a worldview like that, that is absolutely critical for me to understand, because if there is something that's troubling the individual, then I need to have an understanding of why they're being troubled by whatever experience that they've had. And so understanding that foundation, their perspective of the world, their life, or a common term is worldview, is particularly helpful. The second part of your question is then, how do if I'm talking, say, in the role that I had when I first came out of the military, where I had over 120 both chaplains, but the vast majority were mental health clinicians. Often when I was placing people into contracts, I would actually I'd love to get two people, not just one. I'd have a male and a female. And let's say we had one day a week where we were going in and providing support, let's just say at a prison. Ideally, I'd have a team, one male, one female, and I'd have one chaplain and I'd have a mental health clinician, and they would alternate the weeks that they were in. And I found that the chaplain had great coverage of certain topics and areas, and the mental health clinician had great coverage of certain topics and areas. And when things worked well, the two of them were talking and would refer to each other and be able to identify. So it's really important for the understanding of both professionals to know their strengths in the areas that they work in, and know when is a good time to refer to the other.
You haven't talked about this model that you used before, but it's really intriguing. And the question I have for you might not might know might be to answer generally, or you might know details, but what would you say were the strengths of each of those? So what kinds of things were coming out that you said they did a really good job of this, and what things were coming out with the others? And then can you describe the overlap?
Yeah, sure. So there's great medical research into modern day clinical methodologies, modes to support people to refine behavior. So cognitive behavior therapy, narrative therapy, all those things that a clinician has been trained up in. Areas that I think chaplaincy have great strengths in. We tend to label it as a little bit of narrative therapy, but listening is a real strength of chaplains. That's a really good thing that chaplains tend to do really well. The other area that they work really well in is in something that clinically is labeled as forgiveness therapy, but talking to somebody about why a grievance has occurred. Do they perceive themselves to be the victim, the perpetrator? If they're the perpetrator, how do we go about forgiveness of self for what they've done so that we can work through an issue? If they're the victim, how do we get to a point of forgiving the perpetrator or a faceless organization? They're areas that can be of great strength for chaplaincy.
And the overlap of those two, how did you find that they worked well together? Like, what were the things that were like made that such a good match?
So, for example, if I got somebody who was in a life-threatening situation, let's say a car crash, and I'm counselling them, and they're telling me the story, and all of a sudden it starts to be told in the first person. Now this has happened. They're reliving the moment. That's an indicator that there's trauma there. That when they're being re-triggered, the issue isn't passing the amygdala hippocampus. They're going through flight, fight, freeze, fall, fawn response. Immediately, there's no point in me trying to continue talking to the individual. I've got to refer them to mental health clinician, because until that is stabilized, that whenever they recount that issue and they get re-triggered, there's no point in me trying to talk about anything else. Say, for example, that I might want to talk about within a moral injury area.
Yeah. So really what you're describing is each recognizes their scope of practice and when to refer on.
Look, you would have saved us probably about 3 minutes if I had just summarized it right then and used your terminology, but there we go.
But I love the description, because in the description, it gives us sort of a idea of what that looks like, which I think is really important too. What are the strengths and what is coming through? And thinking about sort of, you mentioned worldview, and I want you just to talk a little bit about that worldview, just briefly discussing how that the underpinning concept of right and wrong and how that does work out in therapy, how that comes forward, how you might look at that as a chaplain, and how you might look at that very much in a similar way as a professional psychologist or counselor.
Can I give you an example that really, just as you're saying, that really struck out at me? And this is where I really opened the gateway to me into the area of moral injury. I was counseling an individual who came back from Afghanistan, and he was nearly killed by some mortar rounds. The rounds landed really close to him, about 2 meters away, but the shrapnel all went the other way, actually injured a couple of other soldiers. And he's now, a number of months later, he's back in Australia, and he's even been back in Australia for a couple of months. This guy's married, got a couple of young kids. And I'd seen him a couple of times. He was not coping from a mental health perspective. And he was seeing mental health clinicians, but his situation was deteriorating. And I was sitting with him one day, and I said, so talk to me. And what's troubling? Why are you staring at the ceiling fan at 2 o'clock in the morning? And he said to me, he described the incident. Now, if you had a soldier in front of you, or an ex-soldier who was describing that, what would your response be? What would your diagnosis be?
PTSD.
Sure, and that would be really logical, wouldn't it? It was a near-death experience. It's been more than 3-4 weeks post the event, and his symptoms are deteriorating. Yeah. I pointed out to this young fella, and I said to him, "Hey, man, you grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, didn't you?" He goes, yeah, Pater, absolutely. I said, how many times as a 17, 18-year-old did you get in the car and nearly kill yourself? Oh, he goes, more times than I can remember. I said, so why aren't you staring the ceiling fan about those times? And he looked at me for a long time, and then he turned around and he said, well, the difference is I wasn't married, I didn't have kids then. And you see, I nearly made my wife a widow and my kid's an orphan. And I then said to him, write down your top 3 motivators for deploying to Afghanistan. And we unpacked that. And long story short, the extra pay, the money, I'm going to just abbreviate the medals. So being able to march on Anzac Day and society saying, hey, you've done something in your life.
Wow.
And then and going for his mates. I'm going because my mates are going. I'm not going to let them down.
Yeah.
And I've since asked hundreds of soldiers, thousands of soldiers this, and I get the same thing. Money, medals, mates are the 3 top reasons.
Wow.
And then I said to him, what money, medals, and mates doesn't equate to your wife becoming, losing a husband and your kids becoming an orphan, does it?
Mm.
He goes, no, that's the problem. And I worked out, and we were able to discuss his motivation for deploying wasn't balanced with nearly dying and what he was going to lose. It was actually, that was what was really troubling him. And when we were able to unpack that, this guy had this rapid recovery rate. He discharged from the military, got himself trained up in a new job, and went off happily for the rest of his life. The drama was that he was clinically being told, you got trauma and PTSD. He didn't have trauma and PTSD. He had another issue. For him, that was a particular moral injury. That is how I would describe it, in that his motivation for going didn't equate to the experience that he had whilst on operations. And that's a great example of what we're talking about. The differences between different approaches and where we can potentially get things. The treatment can actually hinder the recovery.
So many things running through my brain that I want to ask, but I just want to just clarify a couple points, and through that maybe the questions will come. Is that you were in the role of a chaplain at that moment because you're going into the belief system and the worldview, which is what we were talking about. But as a clinician myself, what you were saying is that I might look at him and say, yeah, like I did, he's probably got PTSD. So the difference, but I'm thinking that what you're saying about how you ask the question is something I could also do.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not out of my training, but it's just not as much in my awareness. My awareness would be more on the post-traumatic stress. He's going to need some, cognitive behavioral therapy. He's going to need some of these, because that's in my toolbox more than the sliver of the questioning that you went along. So it's possible for somebody like me to ask those questions, and maybe I would, but it's more likely that I would go down a different road.
And that is exactly right. And that's where I find that let's call them schools, both schools have much to offer each other. Yep. And it's silly for me as a chaplain to turn around and say that all those mental health clinicians, they don't have a spiritual belief, let's just throw that away. And in the same way, you don't want mental health clinicians to turn around and say, the vast majority of the world, even in Australia, 60% will still tick a box saying that they're spiritual or they believe in some form of a God. In fact, 60% still in Australia will say they're Christian God. And then if you add up the other worldview face, that there's even those who say, oh, yeah, I'm an atheist. You sit down and really talk to that person, they'll still say, well, you ask them the question of what do you think is going to happen to you after you die? And the vast majority will say, well, I think
something.
Yeah, very few people say. I mean, some certainly do. I don't want to deny that. But when push comes to shove, most people would like to think, at least, that there's something higher and better that they're going to. How much they enact that within their own lives is up to the individual.
Yeah.
So when you start talking or trying to assist people in this space, I find that it is particularly helpful for clinicians, at least, to be open to it.
Yeah. And
be aware of somebody's spirituality, or that they may that their worldview may incorporate such belief structures, because it's particularly helpful in identifying the fundamental problem.
Yes.
As opposed to just saying, it's true. If you've only got if you have a hammer and you have nails, then that's always sometimes
and
you need
probably a lot of people who have been to war do have post-traumatic stress if they're sitting in your office. So it's quite prevalent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there's overlapping symptoms. So that makes complete sense.
Yeah. So just focusing on this idea of the fact that a therapist like myself, or no matter where we are in our career, but hopefully earlier than later, this should be part of our training. That's listening to somebody like you talk about this and give some examples and have us practice through that sort of line of questioning, almost like I'm thinking in my head when I meet somebody. I'm not going to say it's a flow chart, but it's like a flow chart. I'm thinking, if this, then this, if this, then this, are they this or this? And it's sort of how I might start categorizing like what you're saying, getting to that foundation line of questioning will lead me there. But if I'm going down in my space, it might lead me somewhere different. It's almost like I'm priming them to have post-traumatic stress. They would probably even agree with me then.
Correct. But here's the thing. So, for example, when I start off a typical session with somebody who's completely cold, my first question to me often is going to be, hey, Andrew, you were born. What happened next? And away we go. Yeah. And I'll go all the way back there. And the things that the person focuses on are often some of the key things in their life. And it's pretty easy to pick up. Let's say, I was born in Brisbane, and but then I grew up in Sydney, and I went to school in Sydney. Oh, okay. So tell me, why did you move from Brisbane to Sydney? And then, my parents split up at that point, so I went with Mum to Sydney. Okay, that's a bit of a flag for me. Yep. What school did you go to? Oh, I went to some Anglican or some Catholic school. Oh, okay. How did you find that? Oh, it was just rubbish, and I whatever it is. But I'm looking for all these. I'm really tactically questioning. I'm doing. Hey, I really want to unpack you as an individual to understand you and your background and what makes you tick. When I was managing an office of mental health clinicians, it was funny having a chaplain managing mental health clinicians. I couldn't do their professional management, but I did their personal management. They'd often come to me when they had a difficult suicide ideation or something for debriefing. And I found that it was really drummed in. You got 45 minutes and then you got to do case notes. You got 45 minutes to try and they've got a couple of sessions. We're doing a lot of EAP, so they've got a maximum of 6 sessions. Yeah. Great. First session, we've really got to get it all out on the table. And then session 2 and 3, we've got to start the treatment program. And sessions 4, 5, and 6, we need to confirm that they're right to go. And by 6, they should just be walking out the door happy. And you go, yep, get it. That's the structure and that's the reality and all the rest of it. Yeah. But I still don't mind going all the way back to the start point. And I said that great question that I find is really helpful. Andrew, you were born. What happened next? And then it doesn't take too long. And then all of a sudden, I've got a whole wealth of information about the individual, which just gives me a far better understanding of where they're coming from and what could be triggering what's happening now. Because remember, we're after the foundational problem, not just the symptom we're seeing at the moment. Because somebody comes into me and immediately says, you know what, I've got a gambling problem. Yeah. I go, oh, okay, I know what to do with gambling problems. I've been trained about that. A little bit of CBT and da. Yeah. And all we've done is hit the symptom as opposed to the foundational problem.
Yeah. So I'm going to start wrapping up this discussion because we're going to actually talk again and go more in depth into this area of like moral injury a little bit and then how we can do this a little bit more as clinicians. But I just want to sort of wrap up by saying, so it's really actually not as perhaps important for me as a clinician to find out the religious background of somebody, because what you're saying is even the religious background won't give me the information that a spiritual background, which is an individual's background, will give me to work with and find out the precursor to what they're experiencing and why they're sitting in the room with me, actually, what we can do from there.
Yeah, that's perhaps a really helpful way of understanding it, because even if somebody tells me, if I was to be direct and say to them, hey, are you religious? Oh, yeah, I'm a Roman Catholic. Okay, what does that mean? Were you baptized Roman Catholic, or do you go once a year to a church, or are you an Easter Christmas person, or do you have a deep foundational belief where this is indeed your entire life? So I think you're right. And the more we can understand a person's perspective of the world and who they are, and what that means, which is that's their spirituality, that's their subjective view of if they're in part of a major religion, part of a wider objective basis, how do they actually interpret that and then employ that? I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So that gives me a lot of confidence in the fact that I don't have to be necessarily well versed in religiosity, but that there is probably some work I can do to increase my ability to delve into that spiritual space a little bit more, to more accurately get to the foundational issue in therapy a bit sooner.
Yeah, I think so. And even if that means you've got to go do some research, because somebody's worldview, let's say if you've never counseled a nihilist before, so let's take the religion out, as somebody who believes that there is absolutely no basis of right and wrong. Wow, I would then professionally want to go away and investigate that, because that's that individual's worldview. Yeah. And so how can I best assist them to get to a helpful end state?
Yeah. Mick, it's so wonderful to chat with you about this, and I think that what you brought up today, it's been really helpful in understanding this area a little bit more already, and I'm really excited to log in again and do another talk that's a little bit like a deeper dive into that spirituality and worldview sort of discussion. So thanks for this chat. We'll air it off, and we'll come back again.
Yes, no dramas. Just make sure you talk to my agent. I'm sure he'll talk and negotiate some prices and everything else. That'll be fine.
It's all good. Thanks, Mick.
Good on you. Catch you later. Bye-bye.